Okay, all right, good morning. What's today? Monday the 25th? No, 26th. We're in the 8th day of Cheshvan, and today we're going to continue our study of Sefer Yehoshua. We're going to primarily focus on chapter 18, Perek Yud Chet, which you have the psukim in front of you, as well as a few other sources that we're going to mention as well. And we'll see what time allows us to do, if potentially we could leak into chapter 19, or maybe we leave chapter 19 for next week. But the idea is to do it well, right, and to study it well. So I want to read with you together the first 10 pesukim, the first 10 verses of chapter 18, because they're going to be very interesting. At this point, we've conquered the land of Eretz Israel, at least majority of it. We're in the settling portion of the land of Eretz Israel. We've already discussed the settling of the tribes of Yehuda and Yosef's two tribes, Menashe and Ephraim. These were the head honchos of the Jewish people. The tribe of Yehuda and Ephraim and Menashe are the most populous amongst the tribes. They're the most significant in their roles as far as leadership is concerned. And so right in the middle, before we get to the other smaller, I don't want to say less significant, but more secondary tribes, right, in terms of their leadership and their roles in Bnei Israel, we get a very interesting little passage between Yehoshua and the Jewish people, and also a mention of the Mishkan, which is another very important idea. So let's read it together. Okay, I'm going to start on Pasuk Aleph here, chapter 18 of Yehoshua. Vayikahalu kol adat bnei Israel Shiloh. All of the congregation of Israel came together at Shiloh. Has anybody ever been to Shiloh when you've gone to Israel? You could actually go there today. It's a nice area, very big Jewish community there. It's kind of an unassuming place. It's not like Yerushalayim. It's not a bustling city. It's more of a smaller, more village, rural-like area. But you can go there today and actually visit the site of the Mishkan, which is what we're going to read about right now. So the Jewish people gathered at Shiloh, Vayashkinu sham, and they dwelt there at Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. So this is the Mishkan. V'ha'aretz nichbesha lifnehem, and the land was now under their control. So interestingly, until this point, for the 14 years when the Jewish people initially entered the land of Israel, and they spent 7 years conquering the land of Israel, and then 7 years dividing up the land of Israel, for those 14 years, the Mishkan stood at a place called Gilgal. If you remember, we talked about Gilgal. Think back into your memory banks all the way to chapter 3 of Yehoshua. That was the place where the Jewish people camped when they crossed the Jordan River. And that's where they did the first Brit Milah and the first Korban Pesach when they got there. So Gilgal has been the center of the Jewish religious life while they've been all around conquering and settling the land. But after those 14 initial years at Gilgal, Jewish people then transitioned the Mishkan out of Gilgal into Shiloh. And Shiloh is a city in the northern part of the tribe of Ephraim. Okay, so one of the two tribes of Yosef. So after, and that's why it makes sense that it's mentioned here, because after they settled Yehuda and Ephraim, now they're able to move the Mishkan into that spot at the end of the 14 years. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about Mishkan Shiloh, how long it stood there, and some of the other halachic ramifications of when the Mishkan got there. But it's just interesting that in the midst of the process of settling, the Navi makes a point to mention that they placed the Mishkan in this spot to be there, and that would be its permanent home for several centuries. We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's continue reading and see what happens after this. At this point, Yehoshua gets very perturbed at the other tribes. Look what he says. Verse 2. Vayivatru b'nei Israel asher lo chalku et nahalatam. There remained 7 tribes amongst the Jewish people who had yet to divide and conquer and take hold of their portion. Shiva'a shivatim, 7 tribes. Verse 3. Vayomer Yehoshua el b'nei Israel. So that Yehoshua approaches these tribes and says to them, Ad anna atem mitrapim. How long will you be lazy? Will you be negligent? Lavo lareshet et haaretz, to go and to conquer your rightful portions of land. Asher natan lachem Adonai Elohei avotechem, that the Lord your God has given to you. So So this confirms what we've already said until this point, which is after the conquest, the settling also takes a certain amount of courage to go and move your families and put everybody down and lay down your roots and build your homes and drive out the other populations that are still hanging around. This is something that Yehoshua has called for each tribe to do on their own. This is something that they have to do. They have to take that initiative. And whereas the tribes of Judah and the tribes of Yosef, Menashe, and Ephraim have done that to a T, they've gone and taken the initiative and conquered their lands and settled them and expanded them. And we saw that whole conflict about Menashe wanting even more and trying to expand even more. We see that they took the bull by the horns. The other tribes are somewhat lagging behind and they need more motivation and encouragement. And Yehoshua starts to criticize them about this in order to get the ball rolling. Verse 4, Havu lachem shlosha anashim lashavet. To help facilitate this, Yehoshua tells them, choose 3 people from each of the remaining tribes, ve'eshlachem, and I will send them, ve'yakumu ve'yitalechu ba'aretz, and they will be the emissaries to represent each of these nations in helping the rest of their brothers of their tribe to settle the land. Ve'yichdevu ota lefi nachalatam ve'yavo'u elai. The first thing that they're going to do is they're going to walk the land, they're going to map out the portions of land, and then they're going to bring all of those portions of land to me, and we're going to do a lottery to see who gets what, right? So each of the tribes gets 3 people to go and take a look, scout out the land of Eretz Yisrael, write down the different sections that they have and what's there, and then Yehoshua is going to do a lottery to see who gets what, to make it fair. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. So it seems as though that's not 100% the case.
So that is the case. Then why are they getting flack for not settling when they weren't given their portion?
Because they're sitting back instead of going and taking them. In other words, it seems as though Yehoshua is telling them, the land was in front of you, you should be going and taking what taking or at least mapping out or settling. It seems as though there's probably somewhere in between. It seems like the tribes had a general idea of where they were supposed to go as far as their breakdown, because a lot of that has also prophecy. So for example, in Moshe Rabbeinu's last words to the tribe of Zevulun, for example, he says, Zevulun lechof yamin yishkon. You will dwell on the coast by the ocean. So Zevulun sort of understands from Moshe's blessing to him, to that tribe at the end of his life, that they will have some sort of a coastal region. And that in fact is the case. But exactly where and what cities and how far that extends and how inland that's going to be doesn't seem to be already definitive. That seems to be more, the tribe has to go and map out the portion and see what it is. And it has to be given through a lottery from Yehoshua as to exactly how that's going. So there's a little bit of a balance between human initiative and taking your land and expanding those boundaries, and the border that Yehoshua, gives to them. And that also is coupled by other prophecies that we've seen earlier on. But the prophecies and Yehoshua's lottery are more general. They're more, you go to this area. Then as far as actually mapping out your borders and your boundaries, that is something that seems to be more in the hands of the tribe themselves to determine. And we'll see this when we get to chapter 19, because when we get to chapter 19, which talks about all the other tribes, it doesn't give them a clear boundary. It just gives them names of cities that they're supposed to have, but it doesn't say exactly how far that expands. That seems to be in the decision of the tribes to do. And some of the tribes who were late to the party, so to speak, actually are going to get smaller portions of land, because the tribes that already took them, Yehuda and Yosef, and they already started, they took their land and they started expanding more and more and more and taking portions that were not inhabited by anybody at that point, because the other tribes were late getting there, right? So yeah, they weren't assertive. So there's this a little bit of a struggle between the tribes that's going on here as well. But Yehoshua is upset that they haven't done enough to do it already. Take a look at verse 5. Says Yehoshua, these emissaries who map out the land are going to divide it into 7 portions. Yehuda ya'amod al givulo minegev. Yehuda is going to be on the boundary to the south. Ubet Yosef ya'amdu al givula mitzafon, and the tribe of Yosef is going to be more towards the northern boundary. Ve'atem tichtevu et haaretz shiv'a chalakim. You write up all of the remaining portions into 7 portions. Ve'havetem elai henna, and bring them to me. Ve'yariti lachem goral po. I will pick a lottery for it. Lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, in front of the Lord our God. Now, why is there 7 tribes? How did we get to 7 remaining tribes? Well, let's count for a minute. 7 remaining tribes, because we already did Yehudah, we already did Menashe and Ephraim. What else? Who else is already accounted for? Reuven and one more. Who's his other partner? Reuven and Gad. Because Reuven and Gad, where did they take their lands? Outside. They didn't get land in Eretz Yisrael. They take the other portion. So far we did 3 tribes, plus the 2 who were outside, leaves us with only 7, right? What are the 7? We have Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Shimon, who else? And Issachar, and Zebulun. That's 7. What about Levi? Very good. So that's the next pasuk. That's why. So now the Navi already assumes you know all that, and that's why right away in verse 7 they say, Ki en chelek lalviim bekirbechem, because there's no portion of land that is designated for the tribe of Levi. Ki kehunat Adonai nahalato, for they are the priests of God, and that is their portion. Vegad uReuven v'chatzi shevet Menashe, Gad, Reuven, and the other half of the tribe of Menashe, lakhu nachlatan. They took their portion already. Be'ever liyaden mizraha, on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Asher natan lahem Moshe eved Adonai, which was given to them by Moshe, the servant of God. Verse 8, Vayakumu ha'anashim vayalechu. So in the initiative of Yehoshua, these men who are chosen, 3 from each tribe, indeed get up and they go. Vaytzav Yehoshua et ha'olechim lichtov et ha'aretz lemor. He commands all of those who are going to write up the land. V'hitalechu ba'aretz, walk the land. V'kitvu otva, and write about the portions. V'shuvu elai, and return to me. Upo ashlich lachem goral. I will pick the lottery. Lifnei Adonai b'Shilo, and it's going to happen in front of God in Shiloh. So notice all of the operations of the Jewish people, particularly the spiritual operations, have now migrated from Gilgal, where we started for the first 14 years, now to the city of Shiloh. That's where the Mishkan is. That's where it's going to stay, and that's where Yehoshua is centered. Yes. Excellent. Yes, excellent question. We are going to see, we're going to get into chapter 20, is going to discuss all of the cities of the Leviim. The Leviim are essentially scattered all over Am Yisrael. They inhabit special cities that are called Arei Halviim, cities for the Leviim, within portions of the rest of the Jewish people. And what will be significant about that is that the cities of the Leviim will also double, according to some opinions, we'll talk about this in debate, they'll also double as cities of refuge, what we call an Ir Miklat. Ir Miklat are those cities that if, God forbid, someone commits an accidental murder, they run to that city and they seek refuge in that city from any vengeance that the relatives may want to take on them. All of the cities of the Leviim, at least according to the Rambam's opinion, we'll talk about the debate, will also double as cities of refuge for any accidental murderers. And that's where it's going to be important. In total, we will read about 48 Leviim cities scattered throughout the Jewish land. Yes. Correct. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about this when we contrast a little bit Shimon and Levi, because we will notice that Shimon will also not receive his own portion of land. Shimon will actually be swallowed. He will receive cities within the portion of Yehudah. And this is fitting with Yaakov Avinu's prophecy at the end of his life. So we're going to leave this on hold for a little bit. We're going to talk about Shimon and Levi, why they both don't receive, but the very different context in which they don't receive, how it relates to Yaakov, but how one tribe did good and one tribe fell apart a little bit. So we'll come back to that, Be'ezat Hashem. In the meantime, we just noted that we transitioned our central place of worship to Shiloh. Verse 9, we'll close the last 2 Pesukim, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of these ideas in depth. The men indeed go and they pass through the land. They write up all the cities. Leshiv'ah halakim al sefer, and they divide them into 7 portions, and they put it on parchment. Vayavo el Yehoshua el hamachaneh Shiloh, and they bring it back to Yehoshua to the camp in Shiloh. Verse 10, the final one. Vayashlech lahem Yehoshua goral b'Shiloh. Yehoshua, in fact, casts the lottery in Shiloh, lifnei Adonai, in front of God. Vayhalek sham Yehoshua et haaretz livnei Israel kemachlekotam. And Yehoshua divides up the land amongst the Jewish people according to the proper division. So what they couldn't do on their own, Yehoshua sort of facilitates for them, speeds up the process for them. Now they have their portions, but again, they still now have to take the initiative and go and take hold of them and push out any people that might be there and settle the land. And this is not a simple task, as we will see when we get into more detail in chapter 19. The next part of the chapter is going to talk about the next tribe, the tribe of Binyamin. We're going to hold on that for one moment because I want to go back to the beginning and just discuss for a moment the idea of the Mishkan being in Shiloh, how significant that in fact is. So to illustrate how significant it is, I want you to turn over your page, and I'm going to scroll down here on our source sheet to a few Mishnayot. Okay, Mishnah is the oral tradition that was put down on paper by the Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in different tractates. There are several Mishnayot, rabbinic comments here in the oral tradition, in a Masechet called Zevahim, which deals a lot with sacrifices, that says a number of different ideas about the different Mishkans, because the Mishkan, being a temporary dwelling, moved places from one to another, moved its positions, until eventually the Bet HaMikdash, our permanent home, was actually built. So this is not going to be hard. I'm going to explain a few concepts here, but I think some really important ideas will come out of this discussion that I think is very relevant to us. So we're in the Mishnah Masechet Zevachim. This is in the 14th and final chapter of that Masechet. We're going to do 5 Mishnayot together, Mishnayot 4 through 8. They're very short and they repeat themselves. So let's explain it together. And you have the English side to kind of help out. The Mishnah says as follows: Ad shelohu kama Mishkan, before the Mishkan was ever erected in the desert, hayu habamot mutarot. It was permissible to sacrifice on what we call bamot. Bamot are local private altars, which means that people had their own little altars in their backyard, maybe one block. If you lived on Old Farm Road, there was an Old Farm Road altar. And if you lived on Park Avenue, there was a Park Avenue altar, and neighbors, and they were very localized, right? And people can go and you could sacrifice an animal anytime you wanted, right? Va'avoda ba'bechorot. And who sacrificed these? Who did the service? The firstborns, right? So originally that was how it was supposed to be in the Bet HaMikdash as well. Then we switched out the firstborns for the Levites, for the Leviim. However, until we actually got to formalized worship, as long as there was no Mishkan, people had the right to do their own altars, to make their own sacrifices, and the firstborn of each family could perform the service, which means that there was a lot of freedom, very little restrictions, very little regulation as far as korbanot is concerned. However, mishehu kam hamishkan, once the Mishkan was erected, ne'esru habamot. Now, private worship in your own backyard became prohibited because we have a central place for worship. Va'avoda ba'kohanim, and the priests and the Leviim are going to perform the service, those designated people. So now regulations kick in. You can't just do a korban wherever you want, and no person, whoever they want can do a korban. We have designated people who are going to do that service, much more regulated, much more formalized, much more regimented. The Mishnah says that there are different types of sacrifices. Some are considered holy of holies, others are considered a lower level of holiness. It says, if you had a very, very holy sacrifice, the highest level of sanctity, it had to be eaten within the curtains, within the walls of the Mishkan. Kadashim kalim, the lighter forms of sacrifices, bechol machane Israel, could be eaten anywhere inside of the camp. It didn't have to be necessarily inside the walls of the Mishkan. That's a technicality. Let's leave that on the side for a minute. But once the Mishkan is built in the desert, formalized ritual is now in play. Says the Mishnah in number 5, Ba'u la Gilgal. That's our time that we've been just now for the last 14 years. They crossed over the Jordan River. They set up shop in Gilgal in Eretz Yisrael. That was during the 14 years, 7 that they conquered, 7 that they settled. And during that time, surprisingly, huturu habamot. It became once again permissible to ritually sacrifice wherever you wanted. Private sacrifice was once again permitted. And we have to think about why that is. Why all of a sudden we cross into the land of Israel, we start conquering and settling the land, and during these 14 years, we're now all of a sudden allowed to do ritual privately. Can anyone think, why would we allow that? Why did that become allowed? When in the desert it wasn't allowed. In the desert, we had the Mishkan. You have to do everything in the Mishkan. All of a sudden, we bring the Mishkan into the land of Israel and set up in Gilgal. Okay, now you can do whatever you want. Why not? Well, why are they spread out? Okay, so you still have others on the other side of the Jordan, yeah? Excellent, very good, right? So now, during the 14 years that they're fighting and settling, the Jewish people are in flux, right? During the desert time, they're very nicely camped and rooted in one spot. Everybody's very much together. It's easy. Once they go to Gilgal now and they're fighting wars and they're settling lands and they're in the transition phase of trying to spread out through Eretz Yisrael, to require everybody to be limited to the Mishkan would have been way too difficult, way too challenging, and kind of undermining the whole point of what we're trying to accomplish, which is spreading out, conquering the land, and spreading out and settling the land. During that transition phase, while we're in flux, it would have been an undermining the cause to force us to have to come back and ritually sacrifice in the one place every single time. So if a soldier won a war and wanted to give a sacrifice to God, to go all the way back to Gilgal, it would have been a big hassle, would have been very, very challenging and very, very difficult. And so during that 14 years of transition, even though the Mishkan is present in one spot, it's permissible to do your own religious worship. Skip to number 6, to Vav, and here's what we now get at the end of the 14 years, as we're starting to end that transition phase and make things more permanent. Ba'u leShiloh, when they brought the Mishkan to Shiloh, which is what we just read about at the beginning of our chapter 18, that had a big halachic ramification. Ne'esru habamot. Once again, we go back to the status that we had of the Mishkan in the desert, which is that private sacrifice is now once again outlawed. The reason would probably be that now that we're assuming we have settled the land and things are much more calm and much more stable, there is now room to once again reintroduce centralized worship. And in fact, we want centralized worship now, because now that everybody's in their own spots and settled, if we're not in flux, we want to try to bring back that stability of the centralized worship. So once the land is settled and we settled the Mishkan in Shiloh, now the rabbis say the Torah put back the prohibition against private sacrifice. Additionally, something very interesting about the Mishkan at Shiloh, and we'll analyze this in a minute, says the Mishnah, Lo haya sham tikra. There was not a permanent ceiling to the Mishkan in Shiloh. Ela bayit shel avanim. Rather, it was a house made of stone, milematan, from the bottom. In other words, the walls and foundation were stone. V'yiriot milemala, and there were curtains on top. V'hi hayta menuha. This was a resting place. So let's pause there before we read about what the Mishnah says about the sacrifices. A couple of interesting tidbits that the Mishnah gives to us that we have to try and figure out what the meaning behind it is. We come to Shiloh, the private sacrifice is prohibited, that we understand. And now the Mishnah finds a need to tell us a little bit about the architectural description of the Mishkan. And that is that the walls all of a sudden became stone. Now, we have a very high-class group over here who knows that what was the Mishkan made out of in the desert? Remember? Wood. Very good, right? It was made of wooden beams that were coated in gold. All of a sudden, that seems to have gotten rid of, and we all of a sudden make the walls out of stone. But the ceiling of the Mishkan which used to be curtains, that remains. What might this mean for us? Very good, but yet at the same time, it still has that curtain-like temporary feel to it. So the Mishkan at Shiloh, which we're dealing with right now, is sort of a mixture, right? The Mishkan in the desert is really portable. It's really transient. It comes down, it gets taken apart, it gets put up. Its materials are very reminiscent of a temporary home. That's because it was intended to constantly travel and move from place to place. Once we bring it to Shiloh, and we know that we're going to have a little bit more permanence. We've conquered the land, we've settled the land. Now the walls are going to be made of stone. But at the same time, the curtains of the ceiling still remain to show that we are in between, right? We have a level of permanence in the sense that we've conquered the land of Israel and we've been settling the land of Israel. At the same time, there is much to be desired still. The tribes themselves are not 100% steady. The unity amongst the tribes needs work. We've read consistently that there's still enclaves of Canaanite nations inhabiting within the Jewish people that are going to cause us all kinds of problems. So we're in an in-between stage in which we have a certain level of permanence, and at the same time, there's a lot that needs to be worked on. As far as our stability inside the land of Israel, it's not 100% just yet. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And during the book of the Judges, which is going to be our next book, which is pretty much the entire period of time that the Mishkan stays in Shiloh, we're going to read about a lot of challenges that the Jewish people have in trying to make their society more and more stable. They have settled, they're there, we conquered, but there's a lot of stability that is not there yet. There's a lot of religious instability, there's a lot of political instability, there's a lack of unity amongst the tribes, and that's what we need to build. In other words, if I were to say it like this, the Mishkan and its architectural details perfectly mirror the status of the Jewish people. Whatever our status is, our political status, our unity status, it's reflected in what the Mishkan, our central place, looks like. So while we were in the desert and we're constantly moving, it's completely changing, right? We get to the land of Israel, we get more stability, more permanence. Some parts of it change, but there's still a transitional phase. Eventually, when we build the Bet HaMikdash under King Solomon, under Shlomo, and we have full and complete autonomy and sovereignty and rule and reign, and the kingdom is flourishing, and economically we are prospering, and everything is rooted, then we're able to build the Bet HaMikdash, because then it perfectly reflects where we are as a people. I think that's very meaningful when we consider the fact that we don't have a Bet HaMikdash anymore today. That is also reflective of our status as a Jewish people. Our main central place of worship, whether it exists or not, or how it exists, is reflective of where we are as a people. And so that idea, I think, is very, very powerful to illustrate for us who don't have a Bet HaMikdash, is that we're kind of nomadic. We're wandering around. We don't have a clarity that they had once upon a time. We don't have that place to kind of look towards. We're slowly getting it back, right? But it's taking time. But that's, I think, important of how it reflects on us. If we just take a look just for the sake of finishing up the study, and by the way, it's worth mentioning, the Mishkan stood at Shiloh for 369 years. 369 years. That's the Mishkan's longest stint. Okay, so we have 40 years in the desert. Let's see if we can do the math. 40 years in the desert, 14 years in Gilgal. Okay, that's 54. And then we have 369 years in Shiloh. That's the longest stretch. 369 and 54. I think it's 423. 423, yeah. So we're at 423. Watch what happens. Now, the Mishkan eventually gets destroyed in Shiloh. That's when we go to, after the book of Judges, which is the whole period of the Mishkan in Shiloh, we begin the book of Samuel, Shemuel, in the very opening of the book of Shemuel, a devastating war occurs with the Philistines, and they destroy the Mishkan, and they confiscate the Ark of the Covenant, the Aron HaKodesh. And that devastating conquest ends the Mishkan in Shiloh, and the Jewish people move their operations and rebuild a Mishkan in two different places. One is called Nov, and eventually it moves from Nov to Givaon. Between those two places, it stays for another 57 years. 423 plus 57 is 480 years. In the 480th year from when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, this is the chapter 6 of the book of Kings, of Melachim. In the 480th year from when they left Mitzrayim, the Beit HaMikdash is built. That's when Shlomo built the Beit HaMikdash. So we have a perfect transmission of how we get from leaving Mitzrayim and building the Mishkan all the way to the building of the Beit HaMikdash and how it takes its different spots, eventually building a permanent home after David and when Shlomo is the king. Okay, I think that tracing that history is very, very important. It helps us to contextualize a lot of what we're doing here. And we also are able to understand how Shiloh plays a role. It's worth noting in terms of the sacrifices, when the Mishkan was destroyed at Shiloh and went to a different place, again, private sacrifices were once again allowed because, again, the Jewish people were transitioning. They had instability until they built the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. Once the Beit HaMikdash was built, forever it would be prohibited to do any private sacrifices. That became the end all be all. So the rule of thumb is when we have permanence, when there's stability, when the Mishkan and the Ark of the Covenant are together, that's when everything has to work through one spot. It's got to all be centralized and formalized in unity. When things are unstable, when we're in flux, when we're fighting wars, when things have been destroyed, when the enemies are taking us over, when our Ark of the Covenant is not in our hands and we're separated from the Mishkan, then we have no choice but to allow private worship to be going, but it's not ideal. The ideal is to have our own home where everything is good, and that's where we're building and performing our sacrifices. So that's what the Mishkan means to us, and that's why the text of the Navi here makes a point of mentioning that amongst the settling, a significant thing happened, which was putting us in Shiloh. And that's going to be the reflection of the status of the Jewish people moving forward and forward. I'll spend the last 10 minutes or so of this class going through the end of chapter 18, which is the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Binyamin, and we'll close with that. So go back to the first page in verse Yud Aleph, and the first tribe amongst the remaining tribes to be detailed is the tribe of Binyamin. Now that's significant. Remember, we've been talking a lot about the order in which they've been settling. We started with Yehudah, the most significant, the tribe of kings. We went to Yosef, the second significant, Menashe and Ephraim, leaders, cares about Eretz Yisrael, the struggle between Yosef and Yehudah. And now we get Binyamin. Why do you think Binyamin is the next one? Huh? Binyamin's the firstborn? No, that's Reuven. Binyamin's the last. Okay, good. So he's maybe the close of Rachel's tribes, right? That would be significant, right? And we know that Rachel's tribes play a big role. Why else? Any other thoughts? He's the baby, right? Okay, you got to take care of the baby, right? For sure. I'm speaking to a group of mothers right now. I know that, right? You got to always so at one point, we're getting somewhere now. At one point, he was Yaakov's favorite, right? Now, Yosef was also his favorite. That situation turned out disastrously. Binyamin is his favorite. What happens there? Right. But what ends up happening? What's the conclusion of that whole? Good. In other words, the family what? They come together, right? It's amazing. Binyamin is the, what do they call it? The central point, the point of where he's the reconciler of the family, right? Yehudah and Yosef are in constant tension with each other. Yehudah wants to sell Yosef. Yosef is accusing Yehudah. Like they're fighting with each other. And Binyamin is the one who brings the family together. Right? Binyamin is the source, the centerpiece for how the family reconciles and gets down to Egypt, right? And I think that that's very important, right? That's why Binyamin comes next. And Binyamin, right, he deals with his prioritization by his father very differently than the way Yosef deals with his prioritization of his father. You have to levy a little bit of criticism on Yosef, who, when his father loves him and prioritizes him, Yosef is very prideful of that, right? He tells over his dreams to his brothers. He's not really so sympathetic to the feelings that the brothers have. He ignores that part of it. He tattles on his brothers, right? Yosef assumes that role of privilege in a way that antagonizes him towards his brothers. When we find out later in the story that Binyamin is prioritized and loved more than everybody else, but we don't ever find that he elevated himself above anybody, the brothers seem to have a much easier time dealing with Binyamin's prioritization from his father, more so than they do with Yosef, right? And that could be because of Binyamin's own character. It also could be an age thing. He was much younger. Yes. Yes. So there could definitely be a lot of factors that sort of come in. It's very interesting. Like it's funny saying that, like we just had my boy, right, at the end, and my twins are 4. And like we were nervous, my wife and I. We said, like, how are they going to react? Like they've been the babies for so long, and here comes, the prince who's going to encroach on their whole situation. And it didn't happen that way. They love him. They love him. Now that's probably because he's a boy and they're a girl, so it might be different. Oh yeah. Why are you bursting my bubble, Esther? I gotta. Right. I think also, but as Lisa's saying, I think the layoff between children, the age gap can sometimes be different. There's many different variables as why that is, but I don't think there's a question. I personally believe that Binyamin handled the situation much differently and was a source of connection with his brothers rather than a source of antagonism with his brothers. So Binyamin is certainly the cog that everybody pivots around to sort of reconcile the family, right? And that's perhaps a beautiful reason as to why is Binyamin mentioned next? It's also because he has the Bet HaMikdash. The Bet HaMikdash is going to be present, sort of straddling between Yehuda and Binyamin, but the major parts of the Bet HaMikdash are going to be in the section of Binyamin. Binyamin has the city of Yerushalayim, right? So it makes sense that he would be the next one in line, but I think he earns that because the Bet HaMikdash, as we said, reflects unity in Bnei Israel, and the tribe which is uniting to the rest of the Jewish people more than any is the tribe of Binyamin, based on the historical events that have taken place. And it's not a coincidence that if you look at a map, I'll show you a map very, very quickly, but if you look at the map, where does the tribe of Binyamin? It is central to the land of Israel. Okay, you can see here, the blue is the tribe of Binyamin, right? You see it there? It's right in the middle, connecting between Yehuda and the Yosef tribes. And he's perfectly centered between multiple tribes altogether. It's a beautiful thing, right? His location in and of itself represents how much he unifies the Jewish people, being right in the heart, bordering several tribes. He borders Menashe, Ephraim, Dan, Yehuda, Reuven, Gad. 6 different tribes, all bordered around Binyamin, who has the central piece, which is the Bet HaMikdash. He is the unifying tribe of the Jewish people. That's why Binyamin plays such an intense role. And it'll be very interesting when we get to the end of the book of Judges and we see a terrible story about the tribe of Binyamin, how devastating that will be for them. And we'll come back to that topic of the tribe of Binyamin, hopefully when we get there. But Binyamin is the centerpiece of the Jewish people. He's the reconciler, he's the unifier, and that's why he gets mentioned a little bit over here. And that's why perhaps he earned the right to have the Bet HaMikdash. There are many different reasons why the rabbis mention that Binyamin deserved to have the Bet HaMikdash. One could be this idea that we mentioned. Another explanation is he was the only son who was, not the only one, it can't be. Yes, he was the only one of Yaakov's sons who was born in the land of Israel. Every other one of Yaakov's children is born outside the land of Israel. They're all born in the house of Lavan, right? Only Binyamin is born in the land of Israel. And so that's why he merited it. Another rabbinic tradition says that all of the brothers bowed down to Esav when they met Esav in that story. And Binyamin was too little, and therefore he did not bow down in that story. Actually, he wasn't even alive at that time. I shouldn't even say he was little. He wasn't even alive for the reconciliation with Esav. He wasn't alive at that time, so he didn't bow down to Esav. So there's all these different reasons that kind of get mentioned. I prefer this idea of Binyamin being sort of the reconciler of the Jewish people as his main claim to fame as to why he gets the Beit HaMikdash, a building that will unite all of the Jewish people together. I'm not going to read all of the Pisukim in the end of the chapter, and we're a little bit over time, but I just wanted to show you how, although the Beit HaMikdash is not mentioned at the end of this chapter, it's hinted to. So if you look through the Pisukim and you could scan them, the Pisukim give us the boundaries of the land of Binyamin, but consistently there's a few words that pop up that don't pop up in the description of any other tribes. One of them is the word ketef. Ketef literally means a shoulder, or in this context could mean a slope. So there's a lot of hills in the area of Binyamin. There's all these different slopes and ketef, right? There's also the word pe'at, which means like a corner, right? So the text is describing the different cities and the different areas by corners and slopes and all of these different directional models. But these words don't appear in terms of direction in any other tribe's description, just Binyamin. Why do I say that that's significant? Because the words ketef and pe'at are only used elsewhere in the Tanakh when describing the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. Those are the only two other times that those phrases are consistently used. And that's where the text is hinting to us that all of this sloping, all of this, whatever, the shoulders, the directional, are hinting to the fact that Binyamin has the Beit HaMikdash. And if you look at the very end, if you turn over your page, you could see in Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy, in his blessing to Binyamin at the end of his life, he uses one pasuk. It says, Le Binyamin Amar, to Binyamin it was said. Let me scroll down for the people on our Zoom. It says, Le Binyamin Amar, to Binyamin Moshe said, Yedid Adonai, the beloved of God, Yishkon Lavetach Alav, God rests in security upon Binyamin for all time. Chofef Alav Kol Hayom, he protects him and hovers over him all the days. Uben Ketefav Shachen, and he rests between his shoulders. Ketefav. Notice some of the words that Moshe uses. He uses the word Yishkon. What does Yishkon sound like? Mishkan, right? Dwelling, the presence of God, dwelling in Binyamin's midst. He says, Uben Ketefav Shachen, between his shoulders, his slopes, he will reside, talking about God hovering and having his protection there through the Beit HaMikdash. And the word ketef, ketefav, shoulders, ketef, like a slope. These are called ketefaim. Our shoulders are called ketefaim because they slope. They have these kinds of, curvatures, right? And so that's why that pasuk is being used in reference to Binyamin over and over again, because it's talking about not only the geographical and the topographical description of it, but also it's hinting to the idea of the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. To close it off, our rabbis learn from this pasuk that the Beit HaMikdash is to be built on a mountain, but it should be like, there should be higher mountains above the Beit HaMikdash, right? In other words, it's almost like the Beit HaMikdash is on a mountain, but a mountain that is lower than the mountains that are on the sides of it. Like the way you would put something in between your shoulders are above it, and this is below it. That's ben ketefav shachen, between the shoulders are above, and then it's below. What does that illustrate? The protection of Hashem. It's like Hashem's shoulders are protecting over the Beit HaMikdash, and that's how the Beit HaMikdash's place of building actually represents that idea. So everything about Binyamin really centers around the Beit HaMikdash. Its physical properties represent that. Its spiritual and metaphoric properties represent that. Binyamin, being the unifier of the rest of the family, is deserving of having the Beit HaMikdash, and his location brings together so many of the different tribes towards the Beit HaMikdash. And that's why he's a significant player, and the next one mentioned in our pecking order of the different tribes who receive their portion of land. So today we detailed the Mishkan, its transition, what it represents, how it reflects us. And we also spoke a lot about Binyamin and his role and some of the lessons that we can learn from him as a tribe and as a person. And that concludes our study of chapter 18. Be'ezat Hashem, tomorrow, next week, we'll go through 19 and 20 and continue to press on towards the end of the book of Yehoshua. The settlement of the land is almost over, I guarantee you. It's almost over. The 19 is the last chapter, and then the last 4 or 5 chapters go back to some important narratives as Yehoshua comes to the end of his life, and he's going to die and transition and pass the mantle over to the next set of leaders, the judges, and that'll transition us into our next book that we're hopefully going to study together. Any questions or comments before we say goodbye? Okay, excellent, beautiful. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Weather's a little bit bummer, but it is what it is.